"Excuse me, sir," Curtis said politely, raising a trembling hand toward the passing flight attendant. "Could I possibly get some water? My medication." Before the attendant could respond, a voice cut through the cabin like a knife. "Jesus Christ, can't you people wait 5 damn minutes?" Curtis looked up to see a man in a crisp pilot's uniform standing in the aisle, his face twisted in annoyance. The name tag read, Captain Greene. The pilot's eyes, cold, dismissive, entitled, locked onto Curtis with barely concealed contempt. I'm sorry, I just needed," Curtis began. "You just needed," Elliot Greene mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess, you need extra attention? Special treatment? Maybe you should have paid for first class instead of slumming it back here, old man." The words hung in the air like poison. Passengers around them froze, some pulling out their phones, others simply staring in disbelief. Curtis felt heat rise to his weathered face, decades of dignity crumbling under the weight of public humiliation. "I don't want any trouble," Curtis said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to get to my daughter's wedding." Elliot leaned in closer, his breath reeking of coffee and arrogance. "Well, Curtis," he'd glanced at the boarding pass sticking out of the seat pocket, "maybe next time book a flight that caters to people who need their hands held. This isn't a nursing home shuttle." "Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from in the comment section below." Several passengers gasped. A woman too rose back, covered her mouth. A businessman in 12C looked away, ashamed to even witness what was happening. Curtis's hands shook, not from age, but from rage he'd spent a lifetime learning to control. His jaw tightened. His eyes, though glistening with the sting of humiliation, held something else now. Something Elliot Greene was too arrogant to recognize. Calculation. The pilot straightened his uniform with a smirk and turned toward the cockpit, throwing one last glance over his shoulder. "Try not to be a burden for the rest of the flight, yeah?" As Elliot disappeared behind the cockpit door, Curtis sat perfectly still, his mind racing. The other passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to intervene, apologize, or pretend they'd seen nothing. But Curtis Palmer wasn't thinking about apologies. He was thinking about a phone call he was going to make in exactly 5 minutes. Because what Captain Elliot Greene didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known as he strutted back to his captain's chair, was that the old man he'd just humiliated wasn't just any passenger. Curtis Palmer was the majority shareholder of SkyBridge Airlines, the very airline Elliot Greene worked for. And in less than 5 minutes, Elliot's entire world was about to come crashing down at 30,000 feet. How it all began. 6 hours earlier, Curtis Palmer had been standing in his home office in Palo Alto, California, staring at a framed photograph of his daughter, Maya. She was getting married in 3 days in Atlanta, and despite his doctor's warnings about his heart condition, despite his assistant's concerns about the stress of travel, Curtis had insisted on flying commercial. "Mr. Palmer, we can arrange the company jet," his assistant, Jennifer, had said over the phone that morning. "You don't need to deal with the hassle." "Jenny, my daughter specifically asked me not to make a spectacle," Curtis had replied with a gentle laugh. "She wants a normal wedding, with her normal dad, flying like normal people. I'm not showing up in a private jet like some kind of Hollywood mogul." What Curtis hadn't mentioned was the deeper reason. He wanted to experience what everyday travelers experienced. As the principal investor and decision-maker behind SkyBridge Airlines operations, Curtis had spent the last 3 years pushing for better treatment of economy passengers, more legroom, better service, dignity in every interaction. He'd built his fortune in tech, sold his company for $2.3 billion in 2019, and invested heavily in the airline industry because he believed air travel had lost its humanity. SkyBridge was his attempt to change that, to prove that profit and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. But lately, he'd been hearing complaints. Reports of rude staff. Passengers feeling disrespected. Complaints that never seemed to reach the executive level because middle management buried them. So Curtis Palmer decided to fly economy himself. Unannounced. Unrecognized. To see the truth. As he'd boarded Flight 447 from San Francisco to Atlanta that afternoon, Curtis had felt optimistic. The gate agents had been polite. The boarding process was smooth. He'd settled into seat 23B, a middle seat in the back of the plane, with his worn leather carry-on tucked under the seat in front of him. He'd smiled at the young mother struggling with a toddler in 23A, helped her lift her bag into the overhead bin, and even offered the child a piece of butterscotch candy from his pocket. "Thank you so much," the mother had said, relief washing over her face. "Not everyone is so kind." Curtis had simply nodded. "We're all just trying to get somewhere. Might as well help each other out." For the first 90 minutes of the flight, everything had been fine. Curtis had read his Kindle, dozed off briefly, and watched the clouds drift past the window. He'd taken his blood pressure medication on schedule and felt grateful that, despite everything, he was healthy enough to make this trip. Then his throat had started to feel dry. The cabin air, recycled, stale, unforgiving, made it hard to swallow. He'd pressed the call button once, but no one came. He'd waited another 15 minutes before flagging down a flight attendant in the aisle. That's when Captain Elliot Greene had appeared. And that's when everything changed, the pilot's pattern. What Curtis didn't know yet, what he was about to discover, was that Elliot Greene had a history. Captain Greene, 42 years old, had been flying for SkyBridge for 6 years. On paper, he was an excellent pilot, stellar safety record, thousands of flight hours, efficient operations. He'd never crashed, never endangered passengers, and never missed a scheduled landing, but behind the cockpit door, Elliot was something else entirely. He was a bully. To junior flight attendants, he was condescending and dismissive. To passengers he deemed difficult, he was openly hostile. He had a particular disdain for elderly passengers, people traveling with children, and anyone he perceived as low class. To Elliot Greene, flying wasn't about service. It was about power. And in his mind, economy passengers, especially old, quiet ones like Curtis Palmer, didn't deserve respect. They were cargo. Necessary inconveniences. He'd been written up twice before for unprofessional conduct, but both times, his union had protected him. Both times, the complaints had been buried. Both times, he'd walked away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Elliot Greene thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. As Curtis sat in his seat, the humiliation still burning in his chest, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers, weathered, steady, moved across the screen with quiet precision. He opened his contacts. Scrolled to a name, Dorothy Chin, SkyBridge Executive VP. He typed a message, "Dorothy, this is Curtis. I need you to pull the personnel file for Captain Elliot Greene, employee number 447 Delta. I also need the cockpit voice recording and all passenger complaints filed against him in the last 24 months. Send it to my encrypted email within the hour. Do not alert anyone. I'm on one of our planes right now, and I've just been treated in a way no passenger should ever experience. We need to talk. Immediately." He hit send. Then he sat back, folded his hands in his lap, and waited. Somewhere in the cockpit, Captain Elliot Greene was laughing with his co-pilot, probably recounting the moment he'd put that old geezer in his place. He had no idea the clock was ticking. And in exactly 5 minutes, his career was going to end. If you think Captain Elliot Greene crossed the line, hit that subscribe button right now, because only people who side with bullies would scroll past without taking a stand. Curtis Palmer's phone vibrated in his hand exactly 4 minutes after he sent the message. It was Dorothy Chin. He glanced around the cabin. Passengers were settling into their routines, the hum of the engines providing a steady backdrop of white noise. The young mother next to him had finally gotten her toddler to sleep. No one was paying attention to the elderly man in 23B. Curtis swiped to answer, bringing the phone to his ear. "Dorothy," he said quietly. "Curtis, what the hell happened?" Dorothy's voice was sharp, urgent, but controlled. She'd worked with Curtis long enough to know that when he used his encrypted email and demanded immediate action, something serious had gone down. "Are you all right? Are you safe?" "I'm fine," Curtis replied, his voice steady despite the anger still simmering beneath the surface. "Physically, anyway. But we have a significant problem, and it's happening right now, on this flight." "Talk to me." Curtis recounted the incident in precise detail, Elliot's tone, his words, the public humiliation, the way other passengers had reacted. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jesus Christ," Dorothy finally breathed. "Curtis, I'm pulling his file right now. Give me 60 seconds. Curtis waited, listening to the rapid clicking of keyboard keys on Dorothy's end. Around him, the plane continued its steady journey through the sky, oblivious to the corporate earthquake about to hit. "Okay, I've got it," Dorothy said, her voice tight. "Curtis, this is worse than I thought. Captain Elliot Greene has 7 formal complaints filed against him in the last 18 months. 7. All buried by mid-level management. Complaints about verbal abuse, discriminatory language toward elderly passengers, hostile behavior toward flight attendants, intimidation of junior staff." Curtis's jaw clenched. "Why wasn't I informed?" "Because someone made damn sure you wouldn't be," Dorothy replied. The complaints were flagged as resolved through internal mediation. His union rep argued that he was just maintaining cockpit authority and ensuring flight safety. The complaints never made it past regional operations. Who signed off on burying them? Martin Costner, VP of Flight Operations. Curtis closed his eyes. Martin Costner, a man he'd personally promoted 2 years ago. A man he'd trusted to uphold the values SkyBridge was supposed to represent. "Dorothy, I want you to listen very carefully," Curtis said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "I want you to call the cockpit of this aircraft. Flight 447. Right now. I want you to inform Captain Greene that he is being removed from command effective immediately. The co-pilot will assume control for the remainder of the flight. Greene is to exit the cockpit, collect his belongings, and wait in the crew rest area until we land. He is not to interact with passengers or crew. Do you understand? Curtis, if I do that, he's going to know something's up. He'll lawyer up before we even land." "Good," Curtis said coldly. "Let him. I want a formal investigation opened within the hour. I want HR, legal, and our PR team looped in. I want every complaint against him pulled and independently reviewed. And Dorothy, I want Martin Costner suspended pending investigation into why he's been protecting pilots like Greene." Dorothy exhaled slowly. "You're scorching the earth on this one." "Damn right I am," Curtis replied. "This company was built on the idea that every passenger deserves dignity. I don't care if they paid $29 for a basic economy seat or $29,000 for a charter. Respect isn't negotiable. If we can't get that right, we don't deserve to fly." "Understood. I'm making the call now. Curtis, are you sure you're okay?" Curtis glanced around the cabin one more time, at the faces of ordinary people just trying to get home, to weddings, to funerals, to new jobs, to family reunions. People who trusted that the airline would treat them like human beings. "I will be," he said. "Once this is handled. Give me 5 minutes. I'll call the cockpit." The line went dead. Curtis slipped his phone back into his pocket and took a slow, deliberate breath. In the cockpit, Captain Elliot Greene was about to receive a phone call that would change his life forever. Elliot Greene sat in the captain's seat, his hands resting comfortably on the controls as the autopilot guided the Boeing 737 smoothly through the night sky. Beside him, First Officer Amanda Torres was reviewing the approach procedures for Atlanta. "Man, did you see that old guy's face?" Elliot said with a chuckle, breaking the professional silence. "Thought he was gonna cry or something. These entitled old-timers, I swear. They think because they lived through the 60s or whatever, they deserve special treatment." Amanda shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. She'd flown with Elliot twice before and had learned that contradicting him only made things worse. He had seniority, connections, and a union that protected him like a fortress. "You ever notice how it's always the cheap seats that complain the most?" Elliot continued, warming to his subject. "First-class passengers? Never an issue. They know how to behave. But back in economy? It's like babysitting a daycare full of?" The cockpit phone rang. Elliot frowned. Calls to the cockpit during cruise were rare and usually meant something important, weather updates, air traffic control rerouting, or maintenance issues. He picked up the receiver. "Captain Greene." "Captain Greene, this is Dorothy Chin, Executive Vice President of Operations for SkyBridge Airlines." Elliot's posture straightened slightly. He recognized the name. Dorothy Chin was 3 levels above his direct supervisor. She wasn't someone who made casual calls to cockpits. "Yes, ma'am. What can I do for you?" "Captain Greene, I'm calling to inform you that effective immediately, you are being removed from command of Flight 447. First Officer Torres will assume captain authority for the remainder of the flight. You are to exit the cockpit, proceed to the crew rest area, and remain there until the aircraft lands in Atlanta. You are not to communicate with passengers or crew during this time. Do you understand?" Elliot's face went pale, then red. What? What the hell is this about?" "You'll be fully briefed upon landing. This is not a request, Captain. It's a direct order. First Officer Torres is being copied on this communication now." Amanda's headset crackled to life with the same message. Her eyes widened as she looked at Elliot. "This is insane." Elliot barked into the phone. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm in the middle of flying a goddamn airplane." One involves him allegedly making a racist comment to a black flight attendant. Another involves him berating a diabetic passenger who needed medical assistance during a flight. Curtis's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the documents. Each complaint painted the same picture: a man drunk on the small power his uniform gave him, a man who believed his position made him untouchable, a man who had systematically abused anyone he perceived as beneath him. And Martin Costner signed off on burying all of these? Curtis asked. "Every single one," Kevin confirmed. His justification was always the same: maintaining crew morale and avoiding frivolous litigation. He argued that passengers exaggerate, that flight attendants are overly sensitive, that Greene's safety record outweighed interpersonal complaints. Curtis looked up from the tablet, his eyes hard. Martin prioritized convenience over character. He chose institutional protection over human dignity. That makes him complicit. Agreed, Dorothy said. He's already been suspended, but Curtis, he's going to fight this. His lawyer called me 20 minutes ago threatening wrongful termination suits, defamation claims, the works. This is going to get ugly. Let it get ugly, Curtis said quietly. I'd rather fight in court than look in the mirror knowing I let this continue. He handed the tablet back to Dorothy and straightened his jacket. All right, let's go talk to Captain Greene. The airport conference room was sterile and fluorescent bright, a small, windowless space with a rectangular table, 8 chairs, and a water cooler humming in the corner. Elliot Greene sat at the far end of the table, his pilot's uniform still crisp but his face haggard, aged 10 years in the span of 2 hours. Beside him sat Jennifer Alvarado from HR, a woman in her 30s with a laptop open and a voice recorder positioned in the center of the table. She looked deeply uncomfortable. When Curtis Palmer walked through the door, followed by Dorothy and Kevin, Elliot's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: confusion, recognition, dread, and finally, defiance. You, Elliot breathed, standing abruptly. You're the old man from. Sit down, Captain Greene, Curtis said calmly, taking a seat directly across from him. His voice carried no anger, no triumph, just cold, immovable authority. Elliot sat. Curtis folded his hands on the table and looked Elliot directly in the eyes. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence was suffocating. Do you know who I am? Curtis finally asked. Elliot swallowed hard. You're Curtis Palmer. You own the airline. I'm the majority investor, yes. Which means every decision this company makes, every policy we implement, every value we claim to uphold, ultimately reflects on me. Curtis paused. So when you treated me the way you did on that flight, you weren't just disrespecting a passenger. You were demonstrating exactly what this airline has become under the leadership of people who enabled you. Elliot opened his mouth to speak, but Curtis raised a hand. I'm not finished. Over the last 6 years, you've accumulated 10 formal and informal complaints. 10 different instances where passengers or crew members felt degraded, disrespected, or endangered by your behavior. And every single time, the system protected you. Your union protected you. Your supervisors protected you. You learned that there were no consequences for cruelty. Those complaints were exaggerated, Elliot said, his voice shaking slightly. Passengers lie. They want free flights, compensation, attention. I was just doing my job, maintaining order. You called me a burden, Curtis interrupted, his voice still eerily calm. You mocked me in front of a cabin full of people. You suggested I belonged in a nursing home. You treated me like I was less than human because I asked for a cup of water. Elliot's face flushed. I didn't know who you were. And that's supposed to make it better? Curtis leaned forward slightly. You're saying if you'd known I was wealthy, if you'd known I had power, you would have treated me with respect? But because you thought I was just some poor old black man flying economy, I deserved contempt. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Elliot looked down at the table, his hands trembling. Captain Greene, Kevin Richardson said, opening a folder. We're conducting a formal investigation into multiple violations of company policy, including harassment, discriminatory conduct, and creating a hostile environment. You have the right to union representation during this process, but I need to inform you that based on the severity and pattern of behavior documented here, we are placing you on immediate unpaid suspension pending the outcome of this investigation. You can't do this, Elliot said, his voice rising in desperation. I have rights. I have a contract. My union. Your union will represent you through the proper channels, Dorothy interjected. But Curtis witnessed your behavior firsthand. We have corroborating witness statements from passengers on Flight 447. And we have a documented history that shows this wasn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern. Elliot's defiance finally cracked. His shoulders sagged. I didn't mean. Look, it was a long day. I was stressed. Sometimes passengers they push buttons, you know? They don't understand the pressure we're under up there. Curtis studied him for a long moment. Captain Greene, I spent 40 years building companies. I've been under pressure you can't imagine, billion-dollar decisions, thousands of jobs on the line, public scrutiny, market crashes. And never, not once, did that pressure give me permission to treat another human being the way you treated me today. He stood slowly, his full height and presence suddenly filling the small room. You're not just losing your job because you were rude to me. You're losing it because you revealed something broken in this company's culture. Something I'm going to fix, starting now. Curtis turned to Dorothy and Kevin. I want a full cultural audit of flight operations. I want every complaint against every pilot and crew member reviewed independently. I want mandatory respect and sensitivity training for all cockpit personnel. And I want Martin Costner's role eliminated entirely. We're restructuring that division. He looked back at Elliot one last time. Captain Greene, your employment with SkyBridge Airlines is terminated, effective immediately, pending final review. You'll receive documentation within 72 hours. Elliot stared at him, hollow-eyed, broken. Curtis walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. For what it's worth, Captain, I hope you learned something from this. I hope you look back on today and realize that power without compassion is just cruelty with a uniform. And with that, Curtis Palmer walked out of the room, leaving Elliot Greene to face the ruins of the career he'd destroyed through his own arrogance. If you think companies should hold people accountable regardless of their position, drop a comment below saying accountability matters. Let's flood this section and show that kindness isn't optional, it's required. Curtis Palmer didn't go straight to his hotel after the confrontation. Instead, he asked Dorothy to arrange an emergency video conference with SkyBridge's executive leadership team for 11 p.m. that same night, less than 90 minutes away. Curtis, it's late, Dorothy said gently as they walked through the terminal. You've had a long day. This can wait until morning. No, it can't, Curtis replied, his voice firm but not unkind. Every hour we wait is another hour that the culture that created Elliot Greene stays in place. Every delay sends a message that this isn't urgent. I need the leadership team to understand that what happened today isn't a personnel issue, it's a values crisis. Dorothy nodded, pulling out her phone. I'll set it up. But Curtis, you need to prepare yourself. Not everyone is going to see this the way you do. There are people on that board who are going to push back hard. Curtis stopped walking and turned to face her. Let them. By 10:55 p.m., Curtis was seated in a private conference room at the Atlanta Marriott, his laptop open, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him. His tie was loosened, his jacket draped over the back of his chair, but his eyes were alert, focused. The video conference software flickered to life, and one by one, faces appeared in the grid on his screen. Dorothy Chin, Executive VP of Operations, calling from her home office in San Francisco. Kevin Richardson, Chief Legal Counsel, still at the Atlanta airport. Michael Brennan, Chief Financial Officer, a numbers guy in his early 60s who cared more about quarterly earnings than customer experience. Sandra Okoye, Chief Marketing Officer, a sharp strategist who understood brand reputation. Gerald Voss, Head of Labor Relations, a former union negotiator himself who always sided with protecting employees over disciplining them. And notably absent, Martin Costner, the suspended VP of Flight Operations who had enabled Elliot Greene's behavior for years. Curtis waited until everyone was settled, then spoke. Thank you all for making time on short notice. I'm going to be direct because we don't have the luxury of diplomatic language right now. Today, I flew economy on one of our flights from San Francisco to Atlanta. I did this intentionally, without announcement, because I wanted to experience what our everyday passengers experience. He paused, letting that sink in. What I experienced was public humiliation, discrimination, and verbal abuse from one of our captains, Captain Elliot Greene. He mocked me for asking for water. He called me a burden. He suggested I belonged in a nursing home. And he did all of this in front of a cabin full of witnesses. Sandra Okoye's hand went to her mouth. Oh my God, Curtis. It gets worse, Curtis continued. When we investigated, we discovered that Captain Greene has 10 documented complaints spanning 6 years, complaints involving racist language, abuse of elderly passengers, and intimidation of junior staff. All of these complaints were buried by mid-level management, specifically by Martin Costner, who justified his decisions by claiming Greene's safety record outweighed interpersonal issues. Michael Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his video square. Curtis, I understand you're upset, but we need to be careful about making rash decisions based on one incident. This isn't one incident, Michael, Curtis cut him off, his voice sharpening. This is a systemic failure. And I've already made the decision, Elliot Greene has been terminated. Martin Costner has been suspended pending investigation. And we're implementing a company-wide cultural audit starting immediately. Gerald Voss leaned forward, his face filling his camera frame. Curtis, with all due respect, you can't just terminate a pilot without going through proper channels. Greene has union representation. He has contractual protections. If we move too fast on this, we're opening ourselves up to wrongful termination lawsuits that could cost us millions. Let them sue, Curtis said flatly. I'd rather pay lawyers than continue employing people who treat our passengers like garbage. That's easy for you to say, Gerald shot back, his voice rising. You're not the one who has to negotiate with the union. You're not the one who has to explain to 800 pilots why we terminated one of their own based on he was mean to a passenger. Do you understand the precedent this sets? Every pilot is going to be walking on eggshells, afraid that one bad interaction gets them fired. Curtis's eyes narrowed. Good. They should be afraid. They should be afraid that abusing their authority will have consequences. That's called accountability, Gerald. That's called a witch hunt, Gerald countered. And the union is going to fight you tooth and nail. They're going to argue that Greene was doing his job, maintaining cabin order, and that a passenger, no offense, took it personally and is now using his wealth to retaliate. Are you seriously defending what he did? Dorothy interjected, her voice incredulous. I'm not defending it, Gerald said. I'm telling you the reality of how this is going to play out. The union doesn't care about the moral argument. They care about protecting their members. And right now, you've just handed them the perfect martyr. Michael Brennan cleared his throat. Curtis, I have to echo Gerald's concerns from a financial perspective. If we rush this, if we don't follow every contractual procedure to the letter, we could be looking at a multi-million-dollar settlement. Not to mention the operational disruption if the pilots' union decides to stage slowdowns or sickouts in protest. Curtis took a slow breath, controlling his anger. So your advice is what, exactly? That we reinstate Elliot Greene? That we apologize to him? That we let Martin Costner continue running flight operations? My advice, Michael said carefully, is that we slow down. We conduct a thorough investigation. We give Greene's union rep time to mount a defense. We make sure every I is dotted and every T is crossed so that when we do terminate him, if we terminate him, it's bulletproof. And in the meantime? Curtis asked. We put him back in a cockpit? We let him humiliate more passengers. We put him on paid administrative leave, Gerald suggested. We keep him grounded while the investigation proceeds. That's the compromise. It protects us legally and keeps him away from passengers. Curtis leaned back in his chair, studying the faces on his screen. He could see the calculation in their eyes, the risk-averse corporate instinct to protect the institution over the individual, to prioritize legal exposure over moral clarity. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had allowed Elliot Greene to thrive for 6 years. Let me ask you all something, Curtis said quietly. If it hadn't been me on that flight, if it had been someone's grandmother, someone's father, someone with no power, no wealth, no ability to fight back, would we even be having this conversation? Or would that passenger's complaint have been buried just like the previous 10? Silence. Sandra Okoye spoke up, her voice steady. Curtis is right. This isn't about one pilot. This is about what kind of company we are. And right now, the message we've been sending, whether we intended to or not, is that our employees matter more than our customers. That's a brand killer. In today's social media environment, one viral video of a pilot abusing a passenger could destroy us overnight. Exactly, Curtis said, seizing on her point. This isn't just a moral issue, it's an existential business issue. We've built SkyBridge on the promise of treating passengers with dignity. If we can't deliver on that promise, we don't deserve to exist. Michael Brennan sighed heavily. All right, Curtis. I hear you. But if we're going to do this, we need to do it smart. Kevin, what's our legal exposure here? Kevin Richardson, who had been silent until now, adjusted his glasses. Honestly? It's complicated. Greene has union protection, but we also have multiple documented complaints and a first-hand witness, Curtis, who can testify to discriminatory conduct. If we handle this properly, document everything, and follow our own disciplinary procedures, we can defend the termination. But Gerald's right, the union will fight. We should expect arbitration at minimum, possibly litigation. Then we fight, Curtis said simply. And while we're fighting, we fix the culture that created this problem in the first place. Dorothy, I want that cultural audit started within 48 hours. Anonymous surveys sent to every flight attendant, every gate agent, every customer service rep. I want to know who else has been behaving like Elliot Greene and who else has been enabling it. Dorothy nodded. Consider it done. And I want town halls, Curtis continued. I want to meet with pilots, flight attendants, ground crew. I want them to hear directly from me that respect is non-negotiable. That safety and service aren't mutually exclusive. Gerald Voss shook his head slowly. Curtis, you're poking a hornet's nest. The pilots' union is one of the strongest labor organizations in the industry. If they decide you're anti-labor, if they frame this as an attack on working pilots, they can make your life hell. Curtis met his gaze through the screen. Then let them. Because I'd rather fight for what's right than live with what's easy. There was a long pause. Curtis could see the tension in everyone's faces, the fear of legal battles, union conflicts, financial repercussions. But he could also see something else in some of their eyes: respect, agreement, relief that someone was finally willing to draw a line. "All right," Michael finally said. "We'll support you, Curtis. But we do this by the book. Every step documented, every procedure followed." "Agreed," Curtis said. "But make no mistake, Elliot Greene's career with this airline is over. And anyone else who thinks their position gives them the right to abuse people is on notice." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, hammering out logistics, legal strategies, communication plans. By the time Curtis closed his laptop at 12:17 a.m., he was exhausted, not just from the travel and the confrontation, but from the realization that firing one bad pilot was the easy part. Changing the culture that had protected him? That was going to be a war. Curtis stood and walked to the window of his hotel room, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. Somewhere out there, Elliot Greene was probably awake too, making calls, consulting lawyers, preparing to fight. And somewhere out there, Martin Costner was planning his counterattack, rallying allies within the company who valued stability over accountability. Curtis's phone buzzed. A text from Dorothy. "Just got word, Greene's union rep is filing a grievance first thing in the morning. They're claiming wrongful termination and demanding full reinstatement with back pay. This is going to get messy." Curtis typed back. "Let it get messy. We're on the right side of this." He set his phone down and allowed himself a small, tired smile. Tomorrow, he would fly to see his daughter. He would walk her down the aisle. He would celebrate her happiness. But when he got back to San Francisco, the real work would begin. And Curtis Palmer wasn't backing down. If you believe standing up for what's right is worth the fight, even when it's hard, drop a like right now. Only people who think comfort is more important than justice would keep scrolling without supporting this message. 3 weeks later, Curtis Palmer stood in front of 200 SkyBridge pilots assembled in a hotel conference hall in Dallas, Texas. The union had demanded this meeting, a town hall, where Curtis would face the people he'd allegedly betrayed by terminating one of their own. The room was hostile. Arms crossed. Jaws set. A few pilots wore buttons that read "Solidarity" with Elliot Greene's employee number printed beneath. Curtis had been warned not to come. His lawyers had advised against it. Gerald Voss had practically begged him to send a representative instead. But Curtis Palmer didn't send representatives when something mattered. He stepped up to the microphone, his gray suit impeccable, his posture relaxed despite the tension crackling through the air. "Thank you for being here," Curtis began. "I know many of you don't want to be. I know some of you see me as the enemy right now, the rich guy who swooped in and destroyed a colleague's career over one bad interaction." A few pilots nodded. One in the back muttered something Curtis couldn't hear, but the contempt was clear. "So let me tell you what actually happened," Curtis continued. 3 weeks ago, I boarded one of our flights as a regular passenger. I sat in economy, seat 23B. I asked for water because I needed to take my heart medication. And Captain Elliot Greene, a man you're now defending, publicly mocked me. He called me a burden. He suggested I belonged in a nursing home. He treated me like I was less than human." The room shifted slightly. A few pilots uncrossed their arms. "Now, you might say, Curtis, you're sensitive. You took it personally. Pilots are under stress. And you'd be right, pilots are under immense stress. You carry hundreds of lives every single day. You deal with weather, mechanical issues, difficult passengers, impossible schedules. I respect that burden more than you know." He paused, letting the acknowledgement land. "But here's what I can't accept: that stress doesn't give anyone, pilot, CEO, or anyone else, permission to dehumanize other people. And when we investigated Captain Greene's record, we found 10 complaints. 10. Elderly passengers humiliated. Flight attendants intimidated. A diabetic passenger denied medical assistance. This wasn't one bad day. This was a pattern." A pilot in the third row stood up, a black woman in her 40s, her uniform crisp, her expression fierce. Mr. Palmer, with respect, we know Elliot could be difficult. But the union exists to protect us from arbitrary termination. You didn't follow proper procedure. You fired him on the spot because you got your feelings hurt." Curtis looked at her directly. "What's your name, Captain?" "Denise Whitmore." "Captain Whitmore, you're absolutely right, unions exist to protect workers from arbitrary termination. But tell me something, did the union protect the flight attendants Elliot intimidated? Did it protect the passengers he abused? Or did it only protect Elliot?" Denise hesitated. "Because here's what I've learned over the last 3 weeks," Curtis continued, his voice gaining strength. "Your union filed a grievance demanding Elliot's reinstatement. But in that same time period, I've received 43 messages from current and former SkyBridge flight attendants thanking me for removing him. 43 people who finally felt safe enough to speak up. He pulled out his phone and read from it. I once saw Captain Greene make a teenage girl cry because she asked to use the first-class bathroom during a medical emergency. Thank you for standing up to him. Captain Greene told me I was too fat to be a flight attendant and should consider a ground job. I've had an eating disorder ever since. Thank you. I watched Captain Greene mock an elderly veteran in a wheelchair. I reported it. Nothing happened. Thank you for finally listening. Curtis looked up from his phone. So yes, Captain Whitmore, I fired Elliot Greene without going through every bureaucratic step. And I'd do it again. Because sometimes doing the right thing means disrupting the process that protects the wrong people. The room was silent now. Uncomfortable. A few pilots were looking down at their hands. An older white pilot in the front row stood up slowly. Mr. Palmer, I've been flying for 32 years. I knew Elliot. He was a good pilot, safe, competent. But he was also an asshole. A lot of us knew it. And a lot of us said nothing because it was easier not to make waves. He paused, his voice thick with something like shame. I guess what I'm saying is, maybe you didn't just fire Elliot. Maybe you're forcing all of us to look at what we've been willing to tolerate. And that's uncomfortable as hell. Curtis nodded slowly. Change always is. But here's my promise to you, I'm not anti-pilot. I'm not anti-union. I'm pro-dignity. For passengers and crew. And if we can't build a culture where everyone, from the CEO to the passenger in the last row, is treated with basic human respect, then we don't deserve to call ourselves an airline. He stepped away from the microphone, then turned back. One more thing. The cultural audit we conducted revealed systemic issues beyond Elliot Greene. We found supervisors who retaliated against employees who reported misconduct. We found policies that prioritized corporate liability over passenger safety. We found a culture where power meant you could get away with cruelty. Curtis's voice dropped, becoming almost intimate despite the size of the room. I'm fixing it. All of it. And yes, that means some people are going to lose their jobs. But it also means the best of you, the captains who lead with integrity, who mentor junior officers, who treat passengers and crew with dignity, you're going to thrive. Because that's the airline I'm building. He picked up his briefcase and walked toward the exit. As he reached the door, Denise Whitmore called out, Mr. Palmer? He turned. For what it's worth, thank you. For not just talking about values. For actually enforcing them. Curtis smiled, a real, warm smile. That's all any of us can do, Captain. Show up and do what's right, even when it's hard. 2 months later, Curtis Palmer sat in the front row of a small church in Savannah, Georgia, watching his daughter Maya walk down the aisle in a dress that seemed to capture sunlight itself. Tears streamed down his face, not from the confrontation with Elliot Greene, not from the corporate battles he'd fought, but from pure, uncomplicated joy. After the ceremony, during the reception, Maya pulled him aside. Dad, I heard what happened. On the flight. Dorothy told me everything. Curtis started to wave it off, but Maya gripped his hand. You could have used the company jet. You could have avoided all of it. But you flew economy because you wanted to see the truth. That's who you are. That's why I'm proud to be your daughter. Curtis squeezed her hand back, his voice thick. I'm the lucky one, baby girl. As the evening wore on, Curtis received a text from Dorothy. Final arbitration ruling just came through. Greene's termination upheld. Union withdrew further appeals. It's over, Curtis. You won. Curtis looked around the reception, at his daughter dancing with her new husband, at family and friends celebrating love and commitment, at a world that could still be beautiful when people chose kindness over cruelty. He typed back. We all won. Now let's make sure it stays that way. And somewhere, 30,000 feet above the earth, a SkyBridge flight was carrying passengers who would never know the name Curtis Palmer, never know the battle he'd fought. But they'd be treated with dignity. And that, Curtis thought, was victory enough.